Hi, this is Father Michael Stalla. I am the spiritual advisor for Hope's Garden, and today I'd like to talk about the exile and a whisper of hope. So, in the Bible, we have a number of different prophets and historical books, and within that we have kind of a context of something called the exile. Let me show you where it leads up to. So, first we have a sense of God's promise. God promises to Moses, I'm going to free your people from the Egyptians and wander in the desert, but you're eventually going to get to the promised land. So the land is very important for them. Of course, this is where they build Israel and Judah, and eventually they say they want to have a king. They get Saul. God says, you know what, I told you weren't going to like having a king because you got to pay taxes and be ready to go to war and be a soldier and all those things. But that's what you wanted. That's what you got. They said, well, we don't like this guy. This Saul is just very, very hard for us to accept as king. So God places on the throne a new king, King David. And they loved David. And David tried very hard to be faithful to God, though he was imperfect in his attempt. And that is something very unique about the Jewish people. They don't just talk about their perfection, but they also point out their own flaws. So David knows, I'm imperfect, I need God, always trying to be humble before God. And God makes a promise to him that a son of David or a descendant of David will always be on the throne. And so this becomes very big. At one point, there's kind of a division with the country. The nation splits into two, Israel and Judah. Israel gets its own king. Judah, they always say, yeah, but we got a descendant of King David as our king. And they always kind of hold that against Israel. And that becomes a big part of the story. Well, David's son is Solomon. And Solomon decides it's not right that I live in a palace and the Ark of the Covenant is like in a tent out there. I should build a house for God. And he builds the great temple with the materials his father David had left for him. So it becomes one of the great wonders of the world, the temple. There's only one temple. There's not churches on every block like it is today. There's one temple, so people from all over would come here. Of course, the people of Judah, where Jerusalem's located, they use this against the people of Israel. Hey, you guys, you broke away and formed your own nation, but we got the king who's a descendant of David, and we got the temple that God allowed Solomon to build, and God made a promise that he would live with us forever. He didn't make that promise to you, did he? So there is a sense that, a superiority, that we are better than you. Well, at one point, there's these Assyrians, and they come and they attack Israel. And Israel turns to Judah and says, you're going to help us out. And he says, why would we help you out? You broke away from us. You had a civil war and got your own king, and you left us. And they leave them out. And the Assyrians destroy Israel. And Israel would have a very long-term resentment for this. In fact, you hear it at the time of Jesus when he talks about the Samaritans, like, you don't hang out with Samaritans, and how amazing it would be to even have a conversation with a Samaritan, let alone find a good Samaritan. The Samaritans are from the city of Samaria, which is part of Israel. Judah has as its capital Jerusalem. And so this division between the Jews of Judah and the Israelites of Israel, the Samaritans, is just a constant, focus point of their division, and they really, have an animosity toward each other. Well, Judah, who thinks they're superior, thinks they have God's promise, they have the promised land, they got the kingship, they got the temple. They think they're invincible because God made his promise. And lo and behold, the Babylonians show up. It's a Persian empire, and they defeat them in battle and take over. And they're absolutely shocked about this. But it gets worse than that. Then the emperor of Babylon says, I'm going to take everybody who has any skills whatsoever, and I'm going to take them to Babylon. So you can't live in Judah anymore. So he takes virtually everyone out of the town and makes them live in this foreign land. So they've lost the land of Judah. They've lost what was their inheritance from Moses. Their king is in jail. They no longer have a king. They certainly not a descendant of David. And the temple is burned to the ground. It's shocking to them. Now, in the midst of all this, the prophets had been telling them, listen, God gave you some laws. He made a promise to you, but you made a promise you would obey God. I will be your God, and you will be my people. This was the covenant he made with you. But you didn't follow through on your side. And so God many times tried to warn you. And through the prophets was saying, if you keep this up, if you keep doing it your own way and not listening to me, you're going to lose everything. But they wouldn't listen to the prophets. They didn't like the prophets because, who likes to hear a doomsdayer? They all want to hear, hey, God loves you. So here's like, no, God is holding you responsible for not being obedient. It ends up that then the prophets have to come back and they basically say, I told you so. While they're in Babylon, they still have access to Isaiah in particular. But there were others. There were many who had talked to them about this. And it was Hosea who talked about it as being a kind of a marriage situation. Even Jeremiah and Isaiah would kind of hint at this as well. Hosea would say, it's like an unfaithful spouse. God made this covenant with you, and then you weren't faithful to him. God was always faithful to you, but you weren't faithful to him. And to really emphasize this point, God asked Hosea to marry Gomer. And Gomer was a woman who had a very bad reputation. She was beautiful, but she wasn't known for her fidelity, for her chastity. And so while he was married to her, she was unfaithful to him. She cheated on him. And his heart was broken. And his friend said, you know what? Let's stone her to death. That's what the law says. He says, I love this woman. I'm not going to let that happen. Well, she cheats again. He goes, gosh. And his friends say, hey, we tried to warn you, man. Don't blame us on this. Well, he takes her back, and she cheats again. And the friends are like, I don't even want to associate with you anymore. And so Hosea is really heartbroken. He really, really loves Gomer, and he's really trying. But it just doesn't seem like she gets it. It's like she doesn't know how bad it hurts. She doesn't seem to know how much he loves her. And the more he loves her, the more it hurts when she does these things. Then Hosea makes this parallel. Is this what you feel like, God? Do you feel like every time we are unfaithful to your law, do we break your heart? As much as you try to show us how much you love us, we seem to ignore it and just continue to do sin. I had no idea you loved me this much. And if you love me this much, I must hurt you very deeply with my sins. And Hosea tells the people, this is how God feels. God is revealing his heart to us. Now this works for us today in in two different ways. One is sometimes we forget how serious sin is, how much it really offends God, how much he loves us, and how much it hurts him. So it inspires Hosea, as I hope it inspires us, not to sin anymore, not to be unfaithful. But there's another side. We have often been the victims of infidelity when others were unfaithful to us. And there is a level of consolation that God certainly knows what that feels like. And so we do have to connect our hearts with the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Well, as they're talking about this, they're now in exile, and they wonder, is God's promise over? Is his relationship, his covenant with us over? God begins to whisper through the prophets, he has a plan. And in this plan, he will return to you the covenant. And he's hoping that we will start something brand new, something much deeper. And he begins to talk about this, in particular, in the prophets who are saying we're going to go back to Jerusalem, but it's going to be like a new Jerusalem, a heavenly Jerusalem. Ezekiel talks about this in a certain way. The temple is just going to be amazing, better than ever. And is he talking about a physical temple or the physical land? And then there comes the kingship. He talks about a new anointed one who is in the line of King David. And he's talking about the Christ. But they begin to think it's like a warrior who's going to defeat the Babylonians and all their enemies, and eventually the Romans when they show up. It's going to be something like that. But Jesus, of course, doesn't meet their expectations, but is the fulfillment of God's promise. And so they're given something better than just the land. They actually go back to Jerusalem, begin to rebuild the temple. In the time of Jesus, they were still rebuilding the temple. And they still don't have a king. The Romans are now in charge. But what they don't realize is Jesus becomes our king. When they crucify Jesus, they put over his head, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. And in fact, he is a king. He is a king unlike any king we've ever had. He has a crown of thorns, after all. And this king will rule forever, forever. So on the throne will be a king forever. And more than that, why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Because it's the city of David. Joseph shares his family name with Jesus, and therefore Jesus becomes a descendant of David through Joseph. So it's really quite powerful. But more than that, when we're talking about the New Jerusalem, you and I know we're talking about heaven. And so he's going to give us a promised land that will last forever, and we will be there forever. So immediately you begin to see the prophets are talking about coming out of the exile, but they're using it symbolically to point to something much, much greater. In the Song of Songs, we then hear this relationship between a man in love with a woman, and it's like the bridegroom and his bride. And the way that they talk, you might say, well, what are you talking about? It's just a poem between a bridegroom and a bride. Well, what's the issue? There's romantic stories all the time. But there's a definite connection, and it's included in the Bible because of this, of God's deep love for, in some way he would say, Jerusalem, the people of God, the chosen ones of God. But you could also say for us, who are destined to eventually go to heaven, to the promised land. And this imagery is just so powerful because it continues to show us the depths of God's love. Not only does our infidelity hurt him, but he was willing to change everything and form a new covenant to forgive all our transgressions so that we could be again in this loving marriage with God. That is God's ultimate plan, is to marry humanity with divinity. In the person of Jesus Christ, we have this. Jesus is 100% God and 100% human. We have the marriage of humanity and divinity. And where Jesus has gone, we hope to follow. If we join ourselves with Christ, we too will share in the inheritance he wants to give us. He wants us to deeply love God and allow God to deeply love us so that we might share in this gift, this marriage, this covenant. And so there is a great understanding that the whispers of the prophets was toward a hope that tells us who Jesus is. And the primary image that they use is that of the love of a bridegroom. And the Song of Songs gives us this current relationship and our hope for the fulfillment of the relationship. God bless you all.